Today's program of What's Your Evidence deals with a topic that I think is incredibly important for all Americans and even people all over the world to understand. It has to do with the island of Diego Garcia, which is a U.S. military base 7 degrees south of the equator in the middle of the Indian Ocean. I was there for exactly 365 days between August of 1995 and August of 1996 with the U.S. Marines. There was a security contingent there that was supposed to do basically base security in case, I guess, somebody was going to venture to invade the island from far away. I had no idea exactly what we were doing. There was a CIA base, there was an NSA station there too. There were satellites there, but nothing ever seemed very secretive to me. But it certainly was secretive to the people back home, and most people back in the United States have never heard of the place. Today's author, Dr. David Vine, is a professor at American University, currently on sabbatical, and his book, Island of Shame, the U.S. military base on Diego Garcia, caught my attention a few years ago. I was there in the 1990s and couldn't find any literature about the island. And then about 20 years after I left the island and long after I left the Marine Corps, I came across his book and realized that there was so much I just didn't know about it. I really appreciate you coming on the program today, David.
Chris, thanks so much for having me. And I really appreciate your casting light on, as you said, the story that very few people in the United States or around the world know anything about.
And what's interesting about this is that you and I have a different kind of experience with the island. You haven't been able to get on the island itself, but you've actually spent a lot of time with the Chagos Islander people, and you've gone to the Mauritius, which is close enough, and Mauritius is trying to retake control over the islands as well. It's part of a broader archipelago. And I was there in the Marines, and when I first got there, they gave us an indoctrination on the first day. It took about an hour, and the first thing they said was there were never any native islanders here. And to a degree, that you can interpret that as truthful or untruthful, right? Because they were actually brought in. Nobody emerged from those islands, obviously, but they were brought in from other places. And it's not as if they were maybe they weren't exactly lying, but they were certainly obscuring the truth about the history of the people that were there. And they never told us anything about removing the people forcibly or the history of the island at all. And yet when we were there, we saw this coconut plantation, we saw a church, we saw a cemetery, and it was in an area of the island that nobody was really supposed to go, but we ended up doing just some training exercises on that side of the island too. So that's my experience there. It was kind of a paradise. I met my wife there. I benefited tremendously from it. But reading your story, your history of this, of the people of the island and the island itself too, and its purpose as a military base and a British territory, really made me reflect back on the injustices that have been done there for so long. Can you talk about how you got interested in it first?
Sure. Like most people, again, in the United States, I knew nothing of the people who once lived on Diego Garcia and the surrounding islands of the Chagos archipelago. I vaguely knew about the military base on Diego Garcia from the first Gulf War. Diego Garcia is a major Air Force and Navy base, as well as a CIA and NSA base, and playing other roles, as you said. And it's been that way since 1971, when construction on the base started. The part of the story that I knew nothing about, and that at very least the people on Diego Garcia misled you and many other U.S. military personnel about, is that the island indeed has an indigenous population, indeed has a native population that had been living in the archipelago on Diego Garcia and the other islands of the archipelago since the late 18th century, around the time of the American Revolution. As you said, people of enslaved African ancestry and later indentured Indians were brought to the islands by French plantation owners coming from the colony of Mauritius in the Western Indian Ocean. And there had been no prior population as far as anyone knows. And over time, this diverse group of people of mixed African and Indian ancestry developed into a distinct people, a people that has been recognized by other indigenous peoples at the United Nations as an indigenous people, and with their own history, their own culture, their own language, traditions of many kinds. They eventually, of course, won their freedom, their emancipation. And while they lived in a plantation society until the emergence of the base, the people lived an incredibly secure life in islands that, as you described and many others described, are like something like paradise, beautiful tropical islands smack dab in the middle of the Indian Ocean. But between the 1960s and 1970s, the US government, and with the help of the British government, forcibly removed this entire indigenous people, who are known as the Chagosians. For those who don't know, they simply deported them 1,200 miles away to the Western Indian Ocean islands of Mauritius and the Seychelles, and left them there in exile without any resettlement assistance, without their jobs, without their communities, separated from the graves of their ancestors, and destroying the communities that they had built over generations. And the people, the Chagosians, have been now living in exile for more than half a century, struggling to get back home, demanding the right to go back home, demanding that of both the US and British governments. The British government, as you said, controls the islands, but it is clearly a US military base.
So this is actually, and I appreciate you correcting what I had said too about them coming from Africa and India. And so this is really the result of European imperialism, combined effort by the British and the French, right, to bring people from Africa and from the subcontinent to Mauritius and then onto the islands. Is that how it worked?
People arrived in a variety of ways, sometimes via Mauritius, sometimes directly from indeed the Indian subcontinent, or from Mozambique and Madagascar. Over a period of time, a diverse workforce arrived there, but created a home and a new and distinct society over time. Initially, it was the French that controlled Diego Garcia and the Chagos Archipelago. The British Empire controlled the islands since the time of the Napoleonic Wars, since 1814. The British government has claimed control over Diego Garcia and initially ruled it as part of the colony of Mauritius. As part of the independence of Mauritius, the British government pressured the Mauritian government into giving up the islands, and as part of creating a new colony in the era of decolonization. This was Britain's last created colony that they called the British Indian Ocean Territory. And it's precisely this creation of the British Indian Ocean Territory, by chopping off the Chagos Islands from colonial Mauritius, that the International Court of Justice and the UN have ruled was unlawful in 2019. The International Court of Justice and the United Nations General Assembly essentially gave Britain an eviction order and said, you need your sovereignty is unlawful because of the way in which you created this new colony in the era of decolonization, in a way that directly violated United Nations rules of decolonization. And you must cede sovereignty to Mauritius, which is the rightful sovereign. So that's a process that's actually going on right now. The Mauritian government and the British government are engaged in negotiations, finally, a few years delayed, but finally, that is including discussions of the return of the Chagosians to their homeland. So it's actually a very encouraging moment, again, after more than half a century of exile for the Chagosians. And a lot remains to be seen, including, and especially in my mind, the role that the United States government is playing in the return of the Chagosians. The US government could indeed play a very helpful role in assisting with resettlement, in making the base available for the purposes of resettlement, and enabling the reconstruction of the Chagosian societies. and the infrastructure to support their societies, as well as, in my mind and the minds of many others, including the Chagosians, the US government, along with the British government, owe the Chagosians compensation, proper compensation, and reparations for what they've suffered in exile and for the theft of their homelands. The Chagosians received very small amounts of compensation years after being deported, totaling, for those who received it, and not all Chagosians received compensation, the total was $6,000 in today's dollars. Plus, in some cases, families got a cinder block home in Mauritius. $6,000 for having your homeland taken from you, your jobs, your communities destroyed, doesn't really seem proper by any proper sense of that word proper. So the Chagosians have been demanding proper compensation, and indeed that is what the US government can and should do. This is a population that now numbers around 10,000 people. It would not take very much money to compensate them and help them to rebuild their lives as best they can.
And it's interesting, some of the terms that you were using, it's much more holistic. You mentioned British Indian Ocean Territory. We used to call that, on signs everywhere on the island, it says Bayat. And of course, that's how we thought about it, was Bayat. Diego Garcia, we were aware that it was a British territory. There was a British presence there, very small though. But the island itself has a nickname that everybody on the island knew, which is the Footprint of Freedom. And the irony, of course, of that is that freedom isn't really for the actual people who are from Diego Garcia. It's for really the Americans and the Brits. And it is, if people, I'd encourage people to look up Diego Garcia online. You might see some pictures of Chagosians before and after on the island and in the Mauritius, protesting also in Europe as well. But then you'll also see pictures of Americans on Liberty, because after work, then people go on Liberty. There's snorkeling. There is, heavily subsidized activities, recreational activities, checking out boats, things like that. We could rent a speedboat for about $2.50 a day to go across the island. People could fish inside the lagoon, outside the lagoon. It's just an enormous playground, really, for the military. And so it is freedom for the military there in a way, but it's also, you're trapped on the island if you're in the military as well. So there's a lot of kind of ins and outs and ironic terminology, I think, that we can tease out. And what I'm interested in is, why did the United States want the base to begin with?
It's a good question, and that was one of the major questions motivating my research. I was brought into the story when I was in graduate school, and some of the lawyers representing the Chagosians in lawsuits against both the US and British governments contacted me because they needed a graduate student to do some free research, which I was more than happy to do, especially when I learned what had become of the Chagosians, the deep impoverishment that they have suffered in exile, and the basic injustice of having had their homeland stolen from them as part of the creation of this military base. I wanted to do something, and so I began by documenting the effects of the expulsion on the Chagosians' lives for the lawsuits, but I expanded my research more broadly for my PhD dissertation that eventually developed into the book you mentioned, Island of Shame, where I examined the lives of the Chagosians before the expulsion, the history of the islands and the history of their people, as well as the history of their lives since they were forcibly removed from their homes. And I examined the question of why US government officials thought it was necessary and appropriate to forcibly remove an entire people from their homes. I did that by contacting as many former government officials who were involved in the creation of the base and orchestrating the expulsion as possible, as well as diving into the National Archives and archives in Britain and elsewhere to learn the truth of how this base was created and how the people were forcibly removed. The history I was able to uncover is that in the late 1950s and early 1960s, US government officials were essentially looking around the world for islands, strategically located islands, where they could build military bases in the future, fearing that the US military would get evicted from bases around the world as nations were gaining their independence. And they identified, US Navy officials in particular, identified Diego Garcia as a prime location for a base because it was quite isolated and thus offered some protection in that sense. But because it's in the middle of the Indian Ocean, it's within striking distance of a large swath of the globe, from Southern Africa to the Middle East to Southeast Asia. And indeed, again, the base, for those who don't know, is played in just as U.S. officials to a significant extent had in mind, has played key roles in launching and carrying out all the U.S. wars in the greater Middle East, including the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and increasingly has been used to threaten China and Iran. That is the sad history that of this base that, as you said, is referred to by folks in the military as the footprint of freedom, place where now literally billions of dollars have been invested to build up this base, while the Chagosians have been living with nothing like freedom in impoverished exile.
And why did the British want it?
So the British, again, controlled the island since the Napoleonic Wars, since 1814. And the British government was in the process of overseeing the dissolution of the British Empire. They were actually closing and withdrawing from all the bases, as they said at the time, east of Suez.
Mm-hmm.
And they saw, when U.S. government officials approached them about gaining access to Diego Garcia and the right to build a base there, British officials saw an opportunity to hang on to something of a global imperial role. They would give up access to Diego Garcia in exchange for $14 million, which the U.S. military paid secretly to the British government in a way that avoided the oversight of both Congress and Parliament. In fact, all the negotiations were carried out in secret. Successful attempts were made to censor media coverage of the creation of the base and the removal of the Chagosians. And the details of the deal, including the financial arrangement where the United States military transferred $14 million to the British government, as well as the agreement by the British government to carry out the dirty work of getting rid of the Chagosians. All of that was kept secret. Only came to light around 1975 when the Washington Post broke the story in the Western press, and that was 2 years after the last Chagosian had been removed from their homeland.
And when the British acquired it as a result of the Napoleonic Wars, was it because of its location between India and Australia?
Indeed, this is a long-term story of imperial competition. Both the French and British empires were interested in Diego Garcia because of its central location in the Indian Ocean, specifically because of its location along trade routes between Southern Africa and India. The strategic resources of the time were, of course, spices primarily, and the trade in spices. When U.S. government officials began looking at Diego Garcia, they, of course, had more in mind the strategic resources of natural gas and oil, the petroleum resources of the greater Middle East and other parts of the globe, as well as they had a diverse range of interests initially. But over time, the base really has been a major part of U.S. attempts to use military force to control the Middle East and its strategic gas and oil reserves.
And it seems like the future of the global economy, and thus geopolitics, is increasingly being oriented towards the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, because of the population over there, because of the increase in the economy. I'm particularly thinking about Robert Kaplan's book, Monsoon, the Indian Ocean and the Future of American Power. Do you think that that'll make it more difficult for the United States to negotiate with the Chagosians and the Mauritian government?
I don't think so, because the Mauritian government has made it very clear repeatedly in public that they have no intention of asking the U.S. military to leave. In fact, they would like the U.S. military to stay
Okay.
on the base. And in no small part, they surely can see that there might be some financial benefits to allowing the U.S. military to stay and maintaining good relations, which there already exist between the United States and Mauritius. So there has been some really what I would describe as fear mongering as part of a larger fear mongering strategy that many, I would say, irresponsible politicians and some analysts are engaging in around China, that China would somehow gain access to the base on Diego Garcia. There's absolutely zero evidence that the Mauritian government would turn the base over to anyone, let alone China. So the geopolitics of the Indian Ocean, I think in some ways it's been a bit overblown, and there's really no reason it should greatly complicate the negotiations over the future of Diego Garcia and the rest of the Chagos Archipelago. And most importantly, we're again talking about the lives of people who've been removed from their homeland, who have had their homeland stripped from them, and where the just thing is clearly to allow them to go home.
Is there precedent? Is there precedent for this in other cases, other islands, other territories?
There absolutely is. Unfortunately, of course, the Chagosians are not alone in having been forcibly removed by the U.S. military as part of the creation of U.S. military bases or the expansion of bases. I've been able to document, and I discussed this in my book, Island of Shame, as well as in subsequent books. I've been able to document more than 20 cases in which the U.S. military, since the late 19th century alone, has forcibly removed local, mostly indigenous populations during the creation or expansion of U.S. military facilities abroad. This, of course, follows the late 18th and 19th century, during which the U.S. military played a key role in the displacement of native indigenous peoples across North America as part of the colonization of the continent. But
it seems like also this goes into, things like the Spanish-American War, the Panama Canal Zone, the Philippines. There's so much of this history of islands, and even in strategic small places. The Panama Canal Zone is only 10 miles wide, 40 some odd miles long, and yet these strategic places where the U.S.'s concentrated power has affected the people tremendously, and we've gained tremendous financial and geostrategic gains as a result of it. And so it makes it, people don't really learn very much about it, of course.
It's true, yeah. The impacts of the U.S. military, like other militaries that operate foreign military bases, have been severe in many cases, including in the Panama Canal Zone, where there's widespread environmental damage as a result of the long-term U.S. military occupation of the Canal Zone. You did ask, and I apologize for not answering that part of the question. There is precedent where people who have been removed from their homes by U.S. military bases have indeed been allowed to go back home. Some of the Bikini Islanders and others in the Marshall Islands who were removed as part of nuclear testing following World War II have been allowed to go back home. A complicated story, and also one where justice has not been served for the Marshallese who've been displaced and damaged by that nuclear testing. The people of Vieques, of course, forced the U.S. Navy to leave in the 1990s, and have gotten access to most of their island, although there remains severe environmental damage that the U.S. government still hasn't cleaned up. So it's a complicated story. I guess I would just also ask folks to think about, another question that motivated much of my research which is why does the U.S. military, why does the U.S. government, why does the United States have a military base in the middle of the Indian Ocean, thousands of miles from the nearest U.S. border? Does the United States need a military base in the middle of the Indian Ocean? has this served U.S. interests in any fashion? Again, largely this base has been a launch pad for wars in the Middle East that have been, all told, catastrophic for the United States and for, of course, the people of Iraq and Afghanistan. So I think part of what my book Island of Shame and some of my other writing has done is to question this long-standing assumption that the United States needs military bases and hundreds of thousands of troops deployed around the globe for a range of reasons that I discuss in my work. This is a long outdated strategy, a strategy of the early Cold War and World War II, for that matter, that desperately needs to be rethought and transformed, because it is not serving the United States writ large. It is serving perhaps some interests within the military-industrial complex, within the higher echelons of the U.S. military itself. But this strategy, including bases like Diego Garcia, are not advancing the interests of the United States. It is clear to me.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. It occurs to me that your portrayal of Diego Garcia's role, basically, it enables us, it further enables us to be involved in wars that do not serve our interests and don't serve the people over there. I mean, if we didn't have that base over there, then it'd be more difficult for us to imagine a military response to 9/11. And looking back on it, those of us who were former military and not former military after 9/11, we were very much opposed to a military response, not because we didn't think terrorists should be punished, but because the causes of terrorism were much more complicated than that. And as we saw, it's created far more anti-US terrorism and instability in the Middle East, and the repercussions would take volumes, libraries full of the consequences. And Diego Garcia is just one place. Okinawa is another. Chalmers Johnson, the late Chalmers Johnson, spent a lot of time trying to raise awareness about the horrors inflicted on the Okinawan indigenous population because of the U.S. military base there, and they'd already been traumatized by the Japanese Empire, of course, and then to have the effect of the U.S. there. I was in Okinawa for 6 months as well. So, and you ask any military person, especially Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, they'll tell you that everybody I know has served on an island somewhere in the world. And that gets to your other book on that's a base nation, or another version of it is the United States of War. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, those are my two subsequent books, Base Nation and then The United States of War, which together form something of a trilogy with Island of Shame. Base Nation expands beyond Diego Garcia to look at the whole global network of U.S. military bases, which now number around 750 U.S. bases outside the 50 states and Washington, D.C., 750 bases in around 80 countries and colonies, more than around half the countries and colonies on Earth. And then the United States of War looks at the larger pattern of U.S. wars. For quite a while, conducting research about the military and military bases in the post 9/11 period, I thought there was something exceptional about the post 9/11 period, where the United States was perpetually at war, engaged in an endless war that still has not ended despite the withdrawal from Afghanistan. But as I got further into my research, I saw, of course, that there was nothing exceptional about the post 9/11 period, particularly. The United States military has been engaged in war and other forms of combat in nearly every year in U.S. history, every year bar 11 by my count. More than 95% of the years in U.S. history, the U.S. military has been fighting someone. This is a long-term pattern, and so the United States of War looks at the long-term pattern and what is driving it, the economic forces and elite economic corporate interests in particular that often are driving the deployment of U.S. military forces. Often through history, we see the U.S. military playing something of a role as a bodyguard and advance agent for business interests, corporate interests, elite interests around the globe. And so that speaks to the way in which when people talk about, oh, the US military needs to do X, Y, or Z to advance US interests, usually that is a euphemism for very specific interests are being advanced rather than the interests of the United States or all US citizens writ large. They're often business corporate interests that are being advanced by the deployment of US military forces or military bases, as well as, of course, the launching of wars that so often, despite seeking to advance particular business interests, often, as Chalmers Johnson said, using a CAA term, lead to blowback, lead to a variety of ways and a variety of kinds of unanticipated consequences that harm not just people where the US military is deployed, but the United States itself writ large.
I really would encourage our listeners to check out the trilogy, Island of Shame, Base Nation, and United States of War, written by David Vine of American University. Can you tell us what you're working on right now on your sabbatical?
Sure. It's the main focus of my work again is focused on what's driving this long-term pattern of war, because I am quite deathly afraid that the United States will get into perhaps even more catastrophic wars in the future, namely with China or Russia or both, if we don't change course. Because the Biden administration, like the Trump administration before it and prior administrations, is only ratcheting up military tensions with obviously Russia, but China very much as well, including by deploying more military bases surrounding their borders. This is, of course, just one facet of an overall foreign policy that is dominated by military force and the deployment of military force, rather than by diplomatic forces. So part of what I've long been arguing for, along with others across the political spectrum, in fact, is a foreign policy that needs to be transformed in a variety of facets, but one is by drawing down US military bases and forces abroad while building up our diplomatic presence, the presence of embassies and diplomats. This is much needed because, again, I fear there are a growing number of people in the US military, again, the highest ranks of the US military, as well as other parts of the national security bureaucracy, who seem to frighteningly think that a war with China is inevitable. And the fact that they can even contemplate a war with China not spinning completely out of control and becoming a nuclear war that could literally threaten human existence on Earth is beyond me. And this needs to be, for those concerned about such a future, I think we need to be focused on doing everything we can to prevent any kind of military confrontation between China and the United States, and between the United States and Russia, for that matter, as well, given that they Russia, of course, along with the United States, the two largest possessors of nuclear weapons on Earth, who could, estimates have shown, kill something like 5 billion people if a new full-scale nuclear war broke out. This should be profoundly frightening to all of us, and I think speaks to the urgent need to transform our foreign policy away from one dominated by war and military force to one revolving around cooperation, diplomacy, negotiations, and confronting the real threats facing the globe, beginning with global warming, climate change, as well as global poverty, global pandemics, homelessness, hunger, other forms of disease, among many other problems plaguing this planet.
Well, that's very well put. And for our listeners who are interested, one way you can check out what Dr. Vine is talking about is to just look into the comparisons between U.S. federal spending on the military versus, or Defense Department, for example, versus the State Department. It's many times larger. One time I checked, around the time of the Iraq War, it was something like 30 to 40 times larger, the Defense Department budget, which gives an indication about where our priorities are. And I know when I joined the military at age of 20, I was with many others that were similar age or even younger, a little older too. I don't think any of us were thinking in those terms. We definitely thought that the military was there to help people, and in some cases they certainly are. You know, they do some things like inoculating goats in Peru, and disaster relief, and certainly there have been cases during war too where heroism has been displayed, and where battles probably needed to be fought. But the diplomacy that could have been carried out beforehand should have been given so much more weight. We can look back in time. The Guns of August, for example, written by Barbara Tuchman, and books written about the break-in relations between the U.S. and Japan in 1941, or break-in negotiations that is between them, and all sorts of other conflicts have not served us well. So I appreciate so much for you being on the program today, Dr. David Vine, and wish you the best of luck in your next project. And I look forward to reading it too.
Thank you so much, Chris. And I just wish, can we get you into elected office somewhere, or can we make you the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff? Because I don't know, we need someone with this kind of military experience you have, and a far fresher perspective on a productive role for the United States and the world that you possess.
Oh, I appreciate that so much. Likewise, too. And oftentimes they don't listen to the academics, though, right? We're seen as people who are kind of ivory tower, far removed from the reality. But what people don't realize is that research comes from actually being on the ground, and whether that's in the archives or actually talking to people in the places that it matters. So thank you for the kind comments. Right back at you.
Thanks, Chris.
All
Take
right.
care.
Take care.